The evening sun cast a warm glow through the windows of their cozy suburban home as Emily and her husband sat down to dinner. The aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air, mingling with the faint strains of soft music playing in the background. As they ate, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of tension that hung between them like a heavy fog. She stole glances at her husband, noting the furrowed brow and the way he absently pushed his food around his plate. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the unspoken words any longer, Emily's husband set down his fork with a clatter, his gaze fixed on her with a mix of concern and frustration. "Emily," he began, his voice gentle but tinged with an edge of urgency, "there's something we need to talk about." Emily felt her stomach clench with apprehension as she met his gaze, the weight of his unspoken accusation hanging heavy in the air. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Her husband hesitated for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before finally plunging ahead. "It's about the way you talk about your coworkers," he said, his words careful, but laced with a palpable sense of hurt. "And your friends, too. It's like you're always comparing me to them, always finding fault with me, because I don't measure up to some imaginary standard." Emily felt her heart lurch at his words, a rush of guilt flooding through her as she realized the truth of what he was saying. She had never meant to make him feel inadequate, but somehow, in her quest for perfection, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath as she reached across the table to take his hand in hers. "I never meant to hurt you. I love you. You know that, right?" Her husband's gaze softened at her words, a flicker of warmth sparking in his eyes as he squeezed her hand gently. "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But we need to talk about this, Emily. We can't keep ignoring it and pretending everything's okay when it's not." And as they sat there in the quiet stillness of their home, Emily knew that he was right. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The days that followed the confrontation were filled with a palpable tension that hung heavy in the air between Emily and her husband. Every interaction was tinged with a sense of unease, a silent acknowledgement of the rift that had formed between them. Unable to shake the weight of his insecurities, Emily's husband became increasingly distant, disappearing into his own thoughts for long stretches of time. And as the days turned into weeks, Emily found herself growing desperate to bridge the gap that had formed between them. It was on a cool evening in late autumn that her husband finally broached the subject, his voice hesitant but determined as he sat her down in the living room to talk. "Emily," he began, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her heart race, "we need to talk about what happened." Emily nodded, her stomach clenching with apprehension as she waited for him to continue. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," her husband continued, his words measured but tinged with a hint of desperation. "And I think I might have a solution." Emily's brow furrowed in confusion. A solution? To what? Her husband took a deep breath, steeling himself for her reaction. "To the way you've been feeling," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "To the way we've been struggling. I've arranged something unconventional." Emily's heart skipped a beat at his words, a surge of curiosity and apprehension coursing through her veins. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Her husband hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "I've arranged an auction," he said finally, his voice low but determined. "A sort of competition." Emily felt her eyes widen in shock as she processed his words. An auction. Her husband met her gaze, his eyes dark with intensity. "I mean exactly what I said," he said, his voice firm, but tinged with that hint of desperation. "I want to give you the chance to see what else is out there, to see if there's someone else who can make you happier than I can." Emily felt her heart lurch at his words, a rush of conflicting emotions swirling inside her chest. How could he suggest such a thing? And yet, beneath the hurt and the anger, a tiny voice whispered in the back of her mind. Maybe, just maybe, this was what they needed to finally heal the rift between them. With a sense of resignation, Emily nodded, her voice barely more than a whisper as she met her husband's gaze. "Okay," she said, her words tinged with uncertainty but laced with a hint of determination. "Okay, let's do it." And as they sat there in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the weight of their shared pain and uncertainty, Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, this bizarre proposal was the first step towards finding their way back to each other. In the days leading up to the auction, Emily found herself consumed by a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Doubt, fear, and uncertainty gnawed at her insides, each day bringing her closer to the moment when she would have to face the consequences of her husband's bizarre proposal. As the date of the auction drew near, Emily felt a sense of resignation settle over her like a heavy blanket. She knew that she couldn't go on living in a constant state of comparison, couldn't continue to measure her husband against an impossible standard. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of determination, she made her decision. On the night of the auction, Emily stood on the threshold of the dimly lit room, her heart pounding in her chest as she surveyed the scene before her. A group of men had gathered, their faces obscured by shadows as they whispered amongst themselves, their anticipation palpable in the air. With a deep breath, Emily stepped forward, her gaze steady as she addressed the assembled crowd. "I'll do it," she said, her voice ringing out in the silence. "I'll participate in the auction." The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and disbelief, but Emily paid them no mind. All that mattered was the chance to prove her commitment to her husband, to show him that she was willing to fight for their love. As the auction began, Emily watched with a mix of apprehension and determination as the bids rolled in. Each offer brought her one step closer to the moment of truth, one step closer to the realization of her husband's bizarre plan. And then, finally, it was over. The final bid had been called, and Emily stood before the assembled crowd, her heart pounding in her chest as she awaited their verdict. But as the room fell silent, Emily knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The men looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust, their faces twisted in expressions of contempt as they turned away from her, their bids left unspoken. No one wanted to be with her. No one wanted to replace her husband. In that moment, Emily felt a crushing sense of defeat wash over her. She had gambled everything on the hope of redemption, only to be met with rejection and scorn. And as she stood there, alone in the empty silence of the room, Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But maybe, just maybe, this shocking decision was the wake-up call she needed to finally confront the truth and find a way to heal the rift between her and her husband. The echoes of the failed auction lingered in the air, casting a heavy pall over Emily's heart as she stumbled out of the dimly lit room, her steps heavy with the weight of her own shame and regret. She couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief that gnawed at her insides, the bitter taste of rejection burning like acid on her tongue. As she made her way through the empty corridors of the building, Emily couldn't help but replay the events of the evening in her mind, each moment etched into her memory with painful clarity. The hopeful anticipation, the sickening realization of her own inadequacy, the crushing blow of rejection, it was all too much to bear. And yet, amidst the chaos of her thoughts, a single question lingered in the back of Emily's mind. What now? With a heavy heart, Emily returned home to an empty house, the silence of the empty rooms echoing her own sense of desolation. She knew that she had pushed her husband away with her insecurities and her pride, but now, faced with the reality of his absence, she couldn't help but feel a pang of longing for the warmth of his presence. As the hours stretched on into the night, Emily found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. What had gone wrong? Why had she been so blind to the damage she had caused? And most importantly, was there any hope left for salvaging what was left of their shattered marriage? It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains that Emily finally succumbed to the exhaustion that had been building inside her, her eyes closing as she drifted into an uneasy sleep haunted by the specter of her own mistakes. When she finally awoke, the events of the previous night felt like a distant dream, a nightmare from which she could never truly escape. But as she stumbled out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, the reality of her situation came crashing back with all the force of a tidal wave. Her husband was gone, and she was alone. And as she stood there in the empty silence of their home, Emily knew that she had only herself to blame. She had let her insecurities and her pride drive a wedge between them, and now she was left to face the consequences of her own actions. But amidst the wreckage of her shattered dreams, a tiny spark of determination flickered to life within her chest. She couldn't change the past, but she could learn from her mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to win back the love she had lost. With a renewed sense of purpose, Emily squared her shoulders and made a vow to herself. She would do whatever it took to make things right, to earn back her husband's trust and prove to him that she was worthy of a second chance. And as she set out on her journey of redemption, Emily knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But with the memory of her husband's love burning bright in her heart, she was determined to do whatever it took to reclaim the happiness that she had lost. The days stretched into weeks, each one heavier than the last as Emily struggled to come to terms with the reality of her husband's absence. The empty rooms of their home echoed with the ghostly whispers of what once was, a constant reminder of the love she had lost and the mistakes she could never undo. But amidst the wreckage of her shattered dreams, a tiny spark of determination flickered to life within Emily's chest. She knew that she couldn't change the past, but she refused to let it define her future. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, she set out on a quest to win back the love she had lost, no matter the cost. Her first step was to track down her husband, to plead for another chance to make things right. And so, with a sense of trepidation and hope swirling inside her like a storm, Emily set out to find him. It wasn't easy. Her husband had left no trace of his whereabouts, disappearing into the vast expanse of the world with little more than a note of farewell to mark his departure. But Emily refused to be deterred. She scoured every corner of their shared memories, retracing their steps and searching for any clue that might lead her to him. And then, one day, she found it. A scrap of paper tucked away in the back of an old photo album, bearing the address of a small town nestled in the heart of the countryside. With a sense of determination burning bright in her heart, Emily set out to find him, her mind filled with visions of tearful reunions and heartfelt apologies. But when she finally arrived, what she found was not the happy ending she had dreamed of, but a final farewell, a realization that her husband had moved on, leaving her behind to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart. As she stood in the doorway of the quaint little cottage that had once been their home, Emily felt a sense of numbness wash over her like a tidal wave. She had come all this way, fought so hard to find him, only to be met with the harsh reality of his absence. And yet, amidst the wreckage of her shattered dreams, a tiny spark of determination flickered to life within her chest. She couldn't change the past, but she could learn from her mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to find happiness on her own terms. With a heavy heart and a sense of resignation, Emily turned away from the empty doorway and set out on a new path, a path that would lead her away from the pain of the past and towards a future filled with hope and possibility. And as she walked away from the wreckage of her shattered dreams, Emily knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But with the memory of her husband's love burning bright in her heart, she was determined to do whatever it took to reclaim the happiness that she had lost.